It started with a question that no one at the cemetery ever dared to ask: why does that woman come here every single morning, even when it rains? People had seen her countless times. A frail woman in a worn gray coat, her shoes soaked from dew, clutching a bouquet of wildflowers she could barely afford. Her name was Lila. She was poor, quiet, and invisible to the world, except to one man who would soon discover that her story was tangled with his own in a way that would change both of their lives forever. Lila never missed a morning. At exactly 7, she'd walk down the hill, her trembling hands wrapped around the stems of fresh flowers she picked from the roadside. The grave she tended belonged to a woman named Anna Hartley, whose name she spoke softly as though she knew her personally. But the truth was, she didn't. Not really. Years ago, Lila's only son, Evan, had been in an accident. He was a delivery boy who rode his old motorbike through the heavy city traffic to make ends meet. One rainy evening, as he tried to avoid a speeding car, he had swerved into another lane, and hit a woman crossing the street. That woman was Anna Hartley. She didn't survive. Evan did, but his guilt crushed him. He couldn't sleep. Couldn't eat. And just a few months later, he took his own life, leaving behind a note that said, "Tell her family I'm sorry." Lila never found the strength to contact Anna's family. She didn't know who they were. She only knew the name written in the obituary. So she began visiting Anna's grave instead. To apologize. To pray. To bring flowers, because she could no longer bring them to her own son's resting place without feeling the weight of what he had done, and that became her life. A silent ritual of remorse. Every morning, rain or shine, until one day, a black car rolled up beside the cemetery gates. A tall man in a dark suit stepped out. He had the kind of presence that made people turn their heads, a man used to commanding rooms, used to being obeyed. But today, he looked lost. He carried lilies in his hand, white and perfect. His name was James Hartley, and this was the first time he'd come to his wife's grave in almost a year. He stopped when he saw Lila kneeling there. Her hands were dirty from the soil, her flowers small and wilted beside his wife's headstone. He frowned, watching her replace the old ones with new ones she'd gathered herself. "Excuse me," he said softly. She flinched, startled, and rose to her feet, brushing off her coat. I'm sorry, sir. I'll go. I was just leaving." "No, please," James replied. "I just wanted to ask, why? Why do you bring flowers to my wife's grave?" Lila froze. The color drained from her face. "Your wife?" "Yes," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Anna Hartley. She was my wife." Her eyes welled up instantly. I didn't know. I mean, I did, but I didn't know she was your wife." He tilted his head, puzzled. "Then why do you come here?" And that's when her story spilled out, like a confession that had waited years to be heard. She told him about Evan. The accident. The guilt. The apology that was never delivered. Her morning visits. Her prayers. Every word trembled through the air, heavy with pain and sincerity. James listened without interrupting. His face went pale as she spoke, and when she finished, there was only silence between them. The sound of the wind moving through the trees filled the air. Finally, he took a deep breath. "You're telling me, your son was the one who..." She nodded. "He didn't mean to, sir. He was just a boy. He loved his job. He loved life. But after that night, he couldn't live with himself. He thought he destroyed your world." James closed his eyes, his jaw tightening. "He did," he whispered. "For a long time, he did." Lila turned away, tears falling freely now. "I'm so sorry. I come here to ask her to forgive him. Every day. But maybe it was never my place." James looked at the flowers she had laid, small, imperfect, but heartfelt. He thought of his own life since Anna's death. He had buried himself in work, in meetings, in empty rooms and sleepless nights. He hadn't forgiven the driver, nor the world, nor himself. And here was this poor woman, whose son had been broken by guilt, carrying the weight he himself refused to release. I used to think forgiveness was weakness, he said quietly. But now, I think it's the only thing that sets us free. Lila looked at him, confused. James stepped forward and placed his bouquet beside hers. The contrast between the two was striking, his, elegant and pure, hers, humble and wild. But together, they looked complete. Your son made a mistake, he continued. A tragic one. But so did I. I let my anger destroy me. Maybe it's time we both stop punishing ourselves. Lila's lips trembled. You mean, you forgive him? I forgive him, James said firmly. And if your son could hear me, I'd tell him that my wife would too. She was the kindest soul I ever knew. She wouldn't want either of us to keep suffering. Lila broke down, sobbing. For the first time in years, her tears were not only of guilt, but of release. James helped her sit down on the bench beside the grave. They talked for hours, about Anna, about Evan, about love and loss, and how pain connects people who were never meant to meet. When the sun began to set, James turned to her. You don't have to bring flowers anymore, he said gently. Lila looked at him, her heart heavy yet light. But I want to, she whispered. Because now, I don't come to say sorry. I come to say thank you. From that day on, they visited the grave together. Every Sunday, James would pick Lila up from her small apartment, and they'd go to the cemetery side by side. Sometimes they brought flowers, sometimes just their company. They shared silence, memories, and a bond born not of blood, but of forgiveness, and slowly, both their hearts began to heal. The story spread quietly among those who saw them. An old woman and a CEO who shared a grave, shared their pain, and somehow, found peace. People whispered, "Who are they?" But only they knew the answer. They weren't just strangers bound by tragedy, they were proof that forgiveness can grow from the deepest wounds, and that sometimes, love blooms even from graves. And every time Lila placed her wildflowers next to James's perfect lilies, she would smile and whisper to the wind, "Rest easy, Anna. They're beautiful together, aren't they?" Hook for the YouTube viewers, beginning voiceover idea. She came every morning with flowers for a woman she'd never met, until one day, a man in a suit appeared and said, "That's my wife's grave too." What happened next will remind you that forgiveness can change everything. Would you like me to make a YouTube narration script version, with pacing, emotional tone, and pauses for a 10-minute video? It would include hooks, transitions, and closing narration for maximum engagement.